This is Western civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is about slavery, particularly in the pre-modern world, before 1500 CE. In this video, I will cover a number of civilizations in the pre-modern world that had slavery. Furthermore, I will compare and contrast what constitutes a slave society as opposed to a society with slaves. In his book, After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires, historian John Darwin argues that contrary to popular assumptions, empires have actually been quite common in world history. Unfortunately, the same could also be said of slavery. As an institution, slavery has existed in a wide range of civilizations on Earth and has been very, very common throughout early human history. Even in pre-modern civilizations that did not have slavery, such as medieval Europe or ancient India, rigid class structures were common, with an oppressed lower class, for instance serfs in medieval Europe, or the caste system in India. Now, slavery can be defined as a legal status in which an individual is owned by another as a form of property. Slaves are legally bound to their masters. Slaves are forced to work without compensation. They do not come and go as they please. Their master can do what they want with their bodies without facing legal sanctions. And as property, slaves can be bought, sold, and even inherited, all without their consent. Slaves who do not cooperate with their master's demands face punishment, including beatings, whippings, castration, torture, and in the worst case, even murder. As a relationship, the relationship between slave and master is perhaps the most unequal in human society. By far, the status of slave was the lowest in any society in which it existed. The earliest legal recording of slavery in human history is in the Code of Hammurabi. This law code was attributed to King Hammurabi of Babylon in Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi especially deals with how one could fall into slavery because of debt and the issue of what to do with runaway slaves. Now, slavery was pervasive in the ancient world. For example, slavery existed in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Greece, and Rome, and was treated as part of the normal social order. There are a variety of ways in which one could become a slave. One way to become a slave was to be sentenced to slavery for a criminal offense. Another very common way that people became slaves was because of debt, especially as ancient societies often did not have bankruptcy, did not have financial markets with credit to regulate debt. Men who were deeply in debt might become the slave of their creditor or would be forced to sell a family member, such as a child, into slavery. Another way one could become a slave was to be born into it. Some societies allowed slaves to gain their freedom after a certain number of years of service, but being born into slavery was also common. Some societies also had what is called chattel slavery. Now, chattel slavery is a particular form of slavery. It's a condition in which slavery is passed down from parent to child, thus making it a permanent condition. With all of this said, the most common way in ancient societies to become a slave was to be captured in war. Many armies who conquered other countries and cities took people as slaves and deported them back to their home country. Losing a war, thus, could have severe consequences for soldiers and civilians alike, namely slavery. For example, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires in Mesopotamia conquered the Hebrews and deported many Jews back to Babylon as slaves. For their part, the Romans took thousands upon thousands of slaves in the process of conquering the Mediterranean. This disrupted Rome's economy and society, even playing a role in the downfall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. The cruel nature of slavery in Rome also sparked slave revolts, the most famous of which was led by Spartacus, a slave from Greece who led a revolt involving thousands of slaves in Italy between 73 and 71 CE. It actually took several Roman armies and much bitter fighting to put down Spartacus' revolt. The surviving slaves, about 6,000 in total, were crucified publicly along the Appian Way, one of the main roads leading to the city of Rome. This was to make an example of rebelling slaves. Now, in Islam, Muslim warriors waging jihad, or holy war, were allowed to take non-Muslims who resisted as slaves. According to Islamic law, the natural state of all humans is freedom. But Islamic law also allows the enslavement of non-Muslims captured in war or non-Muslims sold to Muslims as well. During the wars of Islamic expansion in the 1st century or even beyond Muhammad, Arabs captured many non-Muslims in wars and enslaved them. Also, the Ottoman Empire, as it expanded and conquered the Balkans and attacked the Caucasus and Slavic lands from the 14th through the 17th centuries, frequently kidnapped people or took prisoners of war, most of whom were Christians and fair-skinned as slaves. Female slaves, especially white females and blondes, were especially seen as sexually desirable by Arabs and Turks, who did have sex slaves and harems. Meanwhile, male slaves who were castrated and made into eunuchs were seen as more valuable as servants in the homes of many wealthy Muslims. Arabs also raided European territories along the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages for slaves, while the Ottomans took slaves from Slavic lands. As late as the 17th century, the Barbary corsairs from North Africa raided and kidnapped Europeans as far away from North Africa as Ireland and Iceland. In addition, from the 7th through the 15th century CE, before the transatlantic slave trade, a lively slave trade existed between the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa and the Islamic world. Africans were sold across the Sahara Desert to the Islamic world in large numbers during this period. In the end, slaves in the Islamic world in pre-modern and early modern times came from 3 main sources: Slavs and Western Europeans, Turks and peoples from the Caucasus, and sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, African kingdoms, especially in Western Africa, had slavery on a common level. Slavery was extremely common. As land was widespread, and slaves were considered a private form of property that produced revenue. As historian John Thornton argues, wars for slaves in Africa were the equivalent of wars for land in other areas of the world. In other words, while in many areas of the world land is a very important commodity, in Western Africa, slaves actually were an important commodity. In the Americas, slaves were also taken in war. The Aztec, for example, took slaves in order to sacrifice people to their sun god, which they did by the thousands. So what were slaves used for? As most pre-modern civilizations were heavily agricultural, many slaves were put to work in the fields. Slaves often were worked very hard on farms, although the worst work for slaves in the ancient world was to be worked in a mine, where some slaves were even worked to death or died in mining accidents. Some slaves were also used as household slaves, for instance, to cook, clean, draw water, or to watch children. Slaves were also used for skilled jobs, such as an artisan. Wealthy Roman women even owned slaves as their hairdressers and had educated slaves from Greece to serve as tutors of their children. If slaves had no control of their bodies, masters also used slaves sexually for their own pleasure, or in ancient Greece and Rome, as prostitutes. In the Islamic world, as previously mentioned, Muslim armies who conquered non-Muslim peoples often took women as sex slaves. Slaves were also used in some cases as fighters or as soldiers. The Romans trained slaves to race chariots or to fight as gladiators, including against other men and against animals, often in front of large crowds for entertainment. And this was entertainment that the Roman emperors used to prop up their political authority. Kings in some sub-Saharan African kingdoms owned soldiers and even had advisors who were their slaves. A group of slave soldiers called the Mamluks even took over Egypt in the 13th century. Historian Joel Moker argues that slavery, especially in ancient Rome and Greece, tended to inhibit technology, as there was less of a need to develop labor-saving machines when slave owners could simply get a slave to do an unpleasant task for them. One thing about slavery in the pre-modern world was that it was not based on race. And this is an important point to make. While slavery was never good, race-based slavery, which is arguably a worse form of slavery and has a particularly ugly legacy in American history, is a product of the modern world. Race-based slavery is a modern concept. In pre-modern civilizations, the race of a person had no bearing on whether or not he or she was a slave. The Romans, for instance, enslaved many Celtic and Germanic peoples, all of whom were fair-skinned and in many cases had blonde or red hair and blue eyes. One final issue to consider with slavery in the pre-modern world is the issue of a society with slaves versus a society versus a slave society. So a society with slaves versus a slave society. A society with slaves is a society where slavery exists but does not dominate the economy or the social order. In a society with slaves, only a small minority of the population are slaves. And while they play a role in the society and in the economy, the society is not dependent on them for its existence or for its main labor force. A slave society, on the other hand, is a society in which slaves are a significant minority of the population, or even perhaps a majority. Slave labor in a slave society is absolutely essential for the economy to function. In essence, in a slave society, slaves are the backbone of the labor force. The Roman Empire, in which about 25 to 40% of the population were slaves, is an example of a slave society. The Greek city-states were likewise slave societies. In contrast, China, during the Han Dynasty, which only had about 1% of its population as slaves, almost all of whom were prisoners of war, Han China was simply a society with slaves instead of a slave society. Since slaves were much less central to the economy and society in Han China, it cannot be defined as a slave society. So let's make some conclusions. In conclusion, slavery was extremely common in pre-modern civilizations and was widely accepted as part of the social order. However, slavery took many forms across time and across different civilizations. Slaves did a variety of tasks and played many different roles. Slavery was always exploitative, but it was hardly the only exploitative type of relationships in the ancient world. Finally, while it's easy to judge pre-modern civilizations for slavery, it's important to put slavery in a historical context. It's also worth remembering that modern civilizations are hardly lacking in exploitative labor arrangements. For instance, race-based slavery and the conditions of workers during the Industrial Revolution. These are both products of the modern world. So I'll stop with this observation. Thanks for watching.